And if you're going to win souls, you've got to love souls. In spite of their meanness, in spite of the way they look, in spite of everything, you've got to seek to bring souls to Jesus Christ because you love them, because Jesus loved them, and because Jesus died for them, and you're trying to bring them to the Son of God.
Thank you for listening to Sandy Creek Stirrings. Of course, I'm your host, Joshua Jimenez, and thank you for joining me today here on the podcast. Today we have an exciting episode for you, and something that really I have learned from, something that I studied out and learned several years back, and as I began going through Scripture and studying out this idea of biblically parenting your children. Something that I began looking at as I became a father, and something that God showed me within the Old Testament. Of course, you saw today's episode title. It's entitled, How to Be a Parent Like Amram and Jochebed, or Parenting Like Amram and Jochebed. And you say, those names, they sound kind of familiar. Who are Amram and Jochebed? And how many ladies do you know named Jochebed? And so that's going to be today's episode, and I'm really excited for it. Before we get into it, let me encourage you. You can always go to sandycreekstirrings.com, and you can listen to our most recent episodes there directly on our website, or you can listen on any of the podcast platforms, the major ones such as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast, Spotify, good night. There's a bunch of them. I know Overcast, we've got a few listeners from there. Radio Public, Breaker, Stitcher, there's a whole bunch of them that you can go and listen on. And so let me encourage you to find whichever platform best suits you, whatever app, and to be a faithful listener whenever the episodes come out. Of course, they come out on Tuesdays and Fridays, and typically they come out right about, just shortly after 1 a.m. in the morning. And I don't know if I have any listeners that early. If you are a listener that happens to listen that early, email me and let me know. That'd be great to hear. You can email me at joshua@sandycreekstirrings.com. And again, that's joshua@sandycreekstirrings.com. That's also where you can email in your questions. If you have a question about God, about religion, about faith, about doctrine, about whatever it may be, I would love to have the opportunity to try and answer that. Can't guarantee that I know all the answers, but we'll make sure we give something biblical and accurate and factual here on the podcast. And so those episodes, as I said, release Tuesday and Friday. And if you listen on one of those podcast platforms, you can select to get notifications sent directly to your phone or whatever device you listen on, and that way you can stay updated when we release new episodes. Let's jump into our topic for today, being parents like Amram and Jochebed. Now, those names may or may not sound familiar to you, but Amram and Jochebed, you may not know them, but I guarantee you, if you've been in church for any length of time, you know who their children are. Now you say, well, hang on a second, that's not bringing to mind any hint of who they are. I don't know who their children are. You may not know who the children of Amram and Jochebed are, but you know who the children. You know the children. You've heard the names of the children before. When you look up to Bible characters, you look up to their children. Their children are some of the most key figures within Bible. In fact, one of their sons, is my favorite Bible character of all time. I just look at him and I love his story, and some of you who know me probably already know who that character is when I said that's my favorite Bible character. And so we're going to talk about that today. Who are those people? Amram and Jochebed, what did they do, and how were they successful at raising children? And when we did a episode just a week or two ago entitled A Parent's Response, I had a lot of good feedback come from that episode, people who wanted to hear more about parenting biblically and hearing some of those biblical truths that God has to share about parenting. And this is something that God used in my life, so I'm praying and hoping that it'll be a blessing to you. I just simply want to pass off the truths that God has shown me in His Word about parenting that I've implemented in my life that has been a blessing that I'm sure will be a blessing for you too. So who are Amram and Jochebed? Who are their children? Well, their children are Aaron. Have you ever heard of Aaron before? A girl by the name of Miriam. And another boy by the name of Moses. Now, if Aaron and Miriam didn't ring a bell, Moses did. That's right, they raised these 3 children. I don't know if they had any more. I'm not completely sure. Honestly, I can't say that I've looked in depth to see if they had other children. I just Honestly, I don't know if they do. These are the only three that I've seen mentioned, the only three that I see mentioned as the children of Amram and Jochebed. So I'm not completely sure if these were their only three children, but let me tell you, they were very successful at raising these three these three children. And obviously you don't pluralize that. And so Amram and Jochebed did a wonderful job. Now, did these children have their ups and downs? Yeah, absolutely. Did they have times of failure? Absolutely. Did they have times of victory? Absolutely. Let me tell you this, though. Amram and Jochebed, these two parents, Amram the father, Jochebed the wife, the mother, they produced and raised children that, by the way, God wanted to use. God wanted to use the children of Amram and Jochebed. I mean, God wanted Moses to lead the Exodus, the exit out of Egypt. God wanted Aaron to be the first high priest. Of the priestly order, God wanted Aaron to be the first one. God wanted Miriam to give him praise and worship after the crossing of the Red Sea, and so she sang songs of praise and worship to God after they crossed the Red Sea. These are children that God wanted to use. And I don't know about you as a parent, or maybe you teenagers listening who, you're not a parent yet, but you're thinking about being a parent one day. I don't know about you, but I want my children to be desired of God, to be used by Him. That's what I want. I want for God to look down from heaven and say, you know what? I want to use your children. That's the children that Amram and Jochebed were able to raise. They were able to raise a son in Moses who always seemed to have God on his mind. I mean, couldn't get away from the relationship that God had with Moses. I mean, it says at the end of Moses' life that he had a relationship with God like no other man. He talked as a man speaketh with his friends face to face. This was Moses, the man who had the burning bush experience, the man who crossed the Red Sea, the man who saw water come out of a rock, the man whose face shone so bright that they had to put a mask over it, not like a medical mask because of COVID, but they had to put a mask over it because it was so bright because he had spent so much time with God as a man speaketh with his friend. They raised children who made it to the hall of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. That's right. Moses made it into the hall of faith. Wouldn't you like to have a child who makes it all the way into the hall of faith? I mean, if you look at the life of Moses, you can see the different truths that they raised within his life with really the only short time period they had with him. Remember, Moses was predominantly raised by the daughter of Pharaoh. They had Moses with them for a short period of time. Amram and Jochebed were very successful with the short period of time that they had with their son Moses. I mean, they raised a young man who in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 24, he admitted the truth in face of consequences. If you go to Hebrews 11, I'm going to read a couple verses. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He admitted the truth of the situation, though the consequences were really death. That's why he had to run. I mean, here's a man who, in verse 25, he chose to live for God, though persecution may come. You see, verse 25, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Here's a man who chose to look to the future rather than be content with present pleasures. Present pleasures. That's a tongue twister for you. And maybe I should give you some tongue twisters sometimes. But he chose to look ahead to the future. He wasn't satisfied with what he had now. He wanted more and more for God. Here's a man who he counted the name of Christ greater than anything this world could offer. If you read verse 26, it says, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. You find in verse 27 of that chapter that he forsakes the world. You find in verse 27 that he remained faithful to God, though God was invisible. Verse 27 says, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. In verse 28, you find he kept the word of God and obeyed it in his life. Verse 28 says, through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Verse 29 says, by faith they passed through the Red Sea, as dry land which Egyptians is saying to do were drowned. You find in verse 29, he saw the miracles of God firsthand, truly because of his faith. This was the child that Amram and Jochebed produced. How did they do it? How did they do it? How did they produce a child of such caliber? How did they produce a child that had such a great walk with God? How did they produce these 3 children? What did they do? That was the question that came to my mind. What did they do? And so let's talk about that today. I want to give you a few things that you can implement as a parent, you can implement into your life. I want you to notice when you go all the way back to the very beginning of Moses' story and the story of Amram and Jochebed, you go all the way back to Exodus chapter 2. You'll find in verse number 1, and there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son. And when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Now, point number 1 that I have written here in my notes is, well, I'll give that to you in just a second. But I just realized something as I read verse 1 that I didn't even have in my notes. This is just coming to me right now, and it's like a movement. And verse number 1 says, and there went a man of the house of Levi and took to wife a daughter of Levi. Did you notice that? He took to wife a daughter of Levi. He was of what tribe? Levi. What tribe was he supposed to marry out of? Levi. Question for you. What was he doing? He was obeying God even before he had children. There are some couples out there, you may be listening. Let me tell you something. You need to learn to start reading your Bible before you ever have children. You need to start learning to be a person of prayer before you ever have children. You need to start learning to be faithful to church before you ever have children. You need to start learning to do things the right way before the children ever come along. Learn to do things the right way before children ever come along. So there's point number 1. Let's go to point number 2, which is actually point number 1 in my notes. I want you to notice that they recognized Moses as good. They recognized Moses as good. Notice what she saw in verse 2. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child. She saw he was a good child. She saw he was goodly. That word goodly means good or precious. It's the same exact Hebrew word that God used to declare his creation good. Remember Genesis chapter 1 where God said, and it is good, it is very good? That same word is the word that she saw within her little baby boy. She said, he is good. Let me tell you this, parents. It is important that parents recognize the strengths and the good things that their kids do. Learn the art of how to praise and encourage your children. When you see them do something good, you need to recognize it, you need to point them out, and you need to praise them for it. Your action should change based on the good that you see out of them. You need the art of learning how to praise and encourage your children. By the way, learning to be an encourager is a big part of allowing other people to become successful. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 11 says, wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify, which means to encourage, which means to build up, and edify one another, even as also ye do. It's important that we go and we edify and we encourage others. Parents have this difficult balance that they have to make. You have to learn the balance of being an encourager, but also being a disciplinarian. Okay, you have to learn to do both. Colossians chapter 3, verse 21 says, fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. All right, so a parent has to keep that fine balance. That fine balance in parenting where they're not only an encourager, but they're also a disciplinarian. You have to do both. You have to do both. But parent, don't side so much on the disciplinarian side that you start missing out on the good that your child is doing. Now, on the same side, when you flip the coin over, don't be so much of a friend that you never discipline them. Just frankly, you are not your child's friend until they learn to obey. You first have to institute that issue of obedience. Then you develop the relationship on the area of being a friend and developing that relationship in that area. But here's the deal. Don't make the mistake of leaning one way. You have to be right down the middle. You have to be both an encourager and you have to be a disciplinarian. You have to learn to acknowledge and encourage your children and acknowledge their hard work in areas that they are doing good in. They made their bed. Hey, you're doing a great job. They took out the trash without being told, hey, I'm so proud of you. You're doing a wonderful job. Hey, let's do this together. Encourage them, praise them. We could fix most of the rebellious children in our culture if we learn to start being more praiseful, is that even a word? If we learn to start praising the people around us more and building them up and encouraging them. She noticed, the parents of Moses noticed his good. They recognized it, that he was a goodly child. But then you know what I find in verse number 2 as well, as we get to this third thing that I want to give you. I find, look at what it says. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Now, if you don't know anything about Exodus chapter 1, you need to go back and read that. What were these people, what were these Israelites commanded to do to their children? What were the midwives commanded to do to the children when a son was born? What were they commanded to do? Yell out the answer right now. What's the answer? The answer is they were supposed to throw that baby boy into the Nile River and let him drown. That's what they were supposed to do. That was society's plan. Society's plan was to throw them in the river and let them drown. But notice what she did. She hid him 3 months. Here's what I find in point number 3 is that they decided to follow God's plan for Moses' life and not the society's. They decided to follow God's plan and not the society's. Pharaoh had wicked plans for Moses. But you know what? The parents chose to follow God's plan for Moses instead of what was politically correct. Here's what I want you to realize. The government at some point will come to the conclusion that it is the government's responsibility to raise your children and not you. If you don't believe me, it was not long ago that Hillary Clinton, yes, that Hillary Clinton said this, and I quote, she said, "We have to break through our private ideas that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families." She said, adding that kids belong to, quote, to whole communities instead. If you think it's never going to get to a point where the government is going to come in and take your children and raise them the way they see fit, then you are blind and you're not paying attention. It's getting to that point, my friend. The government has a plan for your children. They already have a set plan in place. They have a way they want you to raise their children. Your children, they don't want you to force them into religion. They don't want you to force them into anything. You need to keep stop indoctrinating them. Just keep away. Do all these things. They have a plan for them. But as parents, you're either going to have to make the decision that you're either going to follow God's plan or you're going to follow someone else's. And if you go with someone else's, you're dead wrong. It doesn't matter if it's your plan. It doesn't matter if it's someone else's plan. It doesn't matter if it's the government's plan. If you don't follow God's plan, you're in the wrong. You have to decide, I'm not going to follow society's or my friends or anybody else's plan. I'm going to follow God's plan for raising my children. Look, spankings aren't politically correct anymore. Now, anytime I refer to spankings on this podcast, I'm not talking about a beating. I'm not talking about taking a whip to your child when you're angry. It's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a loving, affectionate, brokenhearted, you know what, I don't even want to do this, but it's what's right. Because why? Because it's God's plan. It's not the government's plan to institute spankings. That's why they got rid of them in schools. But it doesn't matter. It's God's plan. And which are you going to follow? Are you going to follow society's plan or God's plan? I mean, teaching kids that homosexuality is wrong, it's a perversion, it's for those who have a reprobate mind. I didn't say that. The Bible said that, okay? And is a sin. Well, that's just not politically correct anymore to teach our children that. I mean, we had a family, this was a long time ago now, and they were allowing their children to come to our church with their grandparents. And they pulled their kids out of church. You know why? Because Brother Josh in junior church said that homosexuality was wrong. So they said, well, our kids aren't going to be allowed to come anymore. Do you realize what I'm saying is that it's not politically correct to teach our children that anymore? That's not the society's plan. The society says, well, we need to accept them. We need to la, 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 la. That's not what God said. Are we going to follow God's plan or society's plan? Teaching your kids to hate abortion, well, it isn't politically correct anymore. By the way, if you need a good resource on abortion, we recorded an episode entitled Legalized Murder, I think is what it was called, and on abortion. So go back and listen to that episode, and that would be episode number It would be episode number 65, and it's not legalized abortion. It'd be on-demand murder and not legalized murder. And so there you go. You can go back and listen to that episode. But it's just not right in society today to teach your children that. But it doesn't matter. What are we going to start doing with God's plan? Are we going to accept it or reject it? I mean, teaching kids why Muslims, Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormons are sending people to hell. Yes, I'm not afraid to say it. I'm not ashamed to say it. You got all these other denominations. And by the way, if you're not willing to stand up for what you are, then you need to go back and figure out what you are. Because if you're not willing to stand for it, then you're not it. You need to go back and figure out what you are. It's not splitting hairs. It's not taking one side over the other. It's standing for truth, because there's a lot of denominations out there that are sending people to a literal lake of fire, a literal hell. And here on Sandy Creek Stirrings, well, we're just not going to pull any punches. We're just going to acknowledge truth for what it is. But that's not politically correct anymore. Here's what parents have to do. In the same way that Amram and Jochebed did, you're going to have to decide whether or not you're going to follow God's plan or if you're going to follow society's plan. Stop letting others tell you how to raise your children. Follow God's plan. God's plan, you say, what is that? Keep them in church, love them, care about them, discipline, teach them, raise them right, do it the right way, do it biblically. That's God's plan. Go through and figure out God's plan for raising your children. Do it the right way. Now, I notice next, point number 4, in verse number 3, it says, "And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink." She, Amram and Jochebed, hid their child from the dangers of the world. They hid him. There was a danger out there. There was somebody that wanted to destroy him, and so they said, we're going to hide you. We're going to protect you. Listen to me, parent. As a Christian, there is an adversary. The Bible says in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse number 8, there is an adversary walking about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. He wants you, but most importantly, he wants your children. There's something dangerous out there in the world, and are you going to protect your children? Are you going to hide them from the dangers of the world? You say, do you mean shelter? Do you mean shelter them? You don't know how often I've heard the term, well, you're sheltered. No. I'm not sheltered. I'm protected. I wasn't sheltered as a child. I was protected. I was protected from the dangers of the world. I like that song that says, I've missed out on the heartache of living a life in sin. I've missed out on facing the world without him. So you know what? I tell the world, they say that I've missed out on a whole bunch of things. No, I've just missed out on all the heartache of all of it. I was protected. Notice the term is that they use that term in verse number 3. She took for him an ark of bulrushes. Where do you hear of an ark before this? You hear of the ark of Noah, right? Noah built the ark. All right? You know what the ark was? The ark was a couple different things. The ark was God's separation from the wickedness of the world. When Noah went into the ark, he was literally separating himself and his family from the wickedness that God was about to destroy. It was a separation. Parents, do not be ashamed at taking steps to separate your children from this world's wickedness. They don't have to see the latest movies. They don't have to stay at the homes of their friends who don't even go to church. They don't have to have the wrong friends. They don't have to have social media. They don't have to have a TV in their room. They don't have to have phones. They don't have to have any of those things. Don't be ashamed to take steps to separate your children from the wickedness of the world. You're not sheltering them. You're protecting them. Hey, can I just throw this out there? Keep them home from the prom. You say the prom? They only have, that's a once-in-a-lifetime event, the prom. Yeah, the once-in-a-lifetime event for your daughter who you raised in church to go dress immodestly, probably, All right, can you have a prom and dress modestly? Sure. But most of the time, you're going to dress immodestly. You have her go with some boy who probably doesn't even go to church, have him holding her around the waist, and they're dancing all along to the wicked, ungodly music, and then they're going to have a kiss goodnight and be introduced to liquor and all kinds of other things at the prom. Hey, let's just skip the prom. You're not sheltering them, you're protecting them. And I'm probably going to get some bad feedback from saying keep your kids home from the prom, but so be it. Get them in the ark here's the deal. Either you get them in the ark and separate them from the wickedness of the world, or you're going to let them drown with the rest of the world in sin. That's the option. Either separate or they drown. The ark was not only God's separation from the wickedness of the world, but it was also God's outlined plan for safety. It was God's outlined plan for safety. God told Noah, if you want to be safe, get you and your family in the ark. That is the safe place. God, in the same sense, gives us parents a guidebook for how we can keep our children safe. This comes, by the way, in the forms of rules. God has given us rules to put in place to keep our children safe. In fact, it's like putting a hedge, it's like putting a protection about our children. Here's what it says in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 8. He that diggeth a pit shall fall into it, and whoso breaketh an hedge, a serpent shall bite him. Parent, if you don't build the hedge, if you don't build the wall, it's an outline plan for safety. You're allowing your children to be exposed to danger. It's like living off of I-75. Like your front yard is I-75. The interstate, if you're unfamiliar with what I-75 is, it's the interstate, all right? You're traveling 70 miles an hour. Zoom, zoom, zoom. 3 lanes of traffic on either side. It's like living off of I-75, the interstate, wherever you are in your area, the highway. You live off of it and letting your children play in the front yard without having a fence or something to protect them from going into the road. It's the same danger. The problem, though, comes when a parent becomes hypocritical and allows the rules to change and break the hedge for the kids. You know what's going to happen? The serpent's going to bite. You say, children, we don't watch movies with cussing in them, but, there's this really great movie they just released. There's this really good movie they just released. Hey, I'll give you an example. There's a movie that came out just not even 2 years ago yet, and a lot of parents were saying, we don't watch movies without cussing, but there's this great movie coming out on abortion, and it's called Unplanned, and, in 2019 is when it was released, and, we don't watch movies with cussing, but, kids, we're going to make this one exception. We're going to make this one exception because, it's a really good movie, and it talks about, abortion and exposes abortion for what it is, and here's the deal. You sit down with your children, and what you're doing is you're teaching them that it's okay to break the hedge because we want to be entertained. We want to be entertained. Yeah, the movie has cussing in it. It has cussing in it. But the problem is we'll allow things to slip by because of our wants and our desires. Your hypocrisy, parent, will allow Satan to bite your children. Whoso breaketh an hedge, the serpent shall bite him. Not only was the ark God's separation from the wickedness of this world, it was God's outlined plan for safety, but it was God's escape from judgment. God's escape from judgment. By going into the ark, they were escaping from the judgment to come. They were escaping from the judgment to come. You know what? You're not sheltering your children. Now, in a sense, yeah, you're sheltering them. If you use the term and you're going to define it, yeah, you're sheltering your children, but not in the way the world says. You're protecting them. You're protecting them. Don't buy into the lies that the world wants to feed you. Dragging your kids to church won't make your kids hate church. The problem is when parents drag their kids to church, but the parents don't drag church to home. That's the issue. That's the issue. So I find they recognized their child's good. They decided to follow God's plan and not the society's. They hid their child from the dangers of the world, but then I find they created a caring culture within their home. They created a caring culture within their home. If you look at verse 4 of that Exodus chapter 2, the Bible says, let's go back to verse 3. And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's brink. Verse 4 says, and his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. I don't see anywhere in that passage where Jochebed looked at Miriam, the sister, and said, hey, I want you to watch him. Let me know what happens. I want you to keep an eye on him. I don't see that anywhere. Her mom didn't tell her to do that. Her dad didn't tell her to do that. Here's a little girl who genuinely cared about her brother. Somehow, in some way, Amram and Jochebed had created a caring culture within their home that caused their family members to care about each other. You and I can do that as well. We can do that by holding family events, by taking a night every week to just be together as a family. Call it a family fun night and do something fun together. Do a craft, watch a movie, play a game. Go on an adventure, go for a hike, call it family fun time, and just do something together. It will create a caring culture within your home. Learn to work together as a family, whether it be in the yard or in the bus ministry or cleaning the church or in the youth ministry or in visitation or a junior church or whatever it may be. Learn to work together as a family. Here's another thing. Require your kids to do chores together. Have one wash the dishes. Have one dry and put away the dishes. Have them help sweep and mop. Have your children learn to work together. Have family devotions together. Here's another one. Recognize each other's strength and use them to accomplish things together. Some of your children are going to be better at some things than your other child. So have that child do something that fits his strength, but have them do it together and allow them to work with each other. Teach your kids to enjoy sacrifices throughout the year, like Christmas. Teach them to sacrifice, to work hard, to take that money they work for to go spend and buy something for somebody else. Teach them to sacrifice for birthdays. Teach them to be a person who enjoys surprises and doing something for somebody else, and you'll begin to create a caring culture within your home. And then last but not least, I want to give you this. At the end of it all, Amram and Jochebed left the results up to God. Amram and Jochebed left the results up to God. Do everything you can do in raising your child for God. Do everything. But here's the deal. At the end of the day, you have to leave the results to God. You may be listening today and you say, my children aren't. They're not in my home anymore. My time raising them has gone on. They're running their own life now. God still has a work to do in their heart. And I don't know, maybe you were unsaved. Maybe you didn't raise your children for the Lord. And you say, what do I do now? I appreciate today's episode. Amen. Yes, do those things, but what do I do now? Here's what you do. You just keep praying and doing what you know you're supposed to do. Don't become hypocritical in your Christianity just because they left home. Don't allow things into the home that you never allowed before just because they're not there anymore. You keep praying, stay faithful to church, keep doing what you know to do. And who knows? Maybe in one of their loneliest parts of their life, on the backside of a desert of sin, they just might have a burning bush experience where God is able to call out to them because of your continued prayers. You say, why would God go to Moses? I mean, a murderer at this point. Why would God go to Moses and call him out and say, hey, I want you to lead? I don't know why. The Bible doesn't say this, so this is just my personal opinion. All right, I don't know for sure, but this is just my personal opinion. You can take it or leave it. You can like it or lump it. You can do whatever you want with it. I don't really care. Here's my opinion. Moses is gone. He's on the backside of the wilderness in Sinai, a lonely shepherd. But back in Egypt, there's a mom and there's a dad named Amram and Jochebed, who every night they're on their knees and saying, God, we don't even We don't even know where our boy is. We don't know where he's at, but God, would you do something with him? God, would you please touch his life? God, would you call him to do something? God, we know the trouble that he got into, but God, would you do something with our little boy? God, we raised him for you. God, we saw his good. God, we followed your plan. God, we hid him from the dangers of the world. We created a caring culture within our home. Would you please do something? Would you please reach out to him? And God answered that prayer one day, when a little bush became burned up with the glory of God. And God called that little boy based on the prayers of a mom and dad. Parents, even if your child has left the home, you still have a big responsibility in encouraging them to do right with their life. Don't give up. Don't give in. Here's what you need to do. Get earnest in your prayer life for your child. Get earnest in your prayer life for your child. And keep doing what you know you're supposed to be doing. So, parenting like Amram and Jochebed, how can we do that? Well, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to, well, as we said today, add it in a brand new, fresh point. You've got to start off your marriage right and start living right before the children even get here. But then you need to recognize the good in your children. You need to decide to follow God's plan and not the society's. You need to hide them from the dangers of the world. You need to create a caring culture within their home. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to realize that you're going to have to leave the results up to God. Keep praying earnestly and keep doing what you're supposed to be doing. And maybe one day you'll have children who God can put into a new hall of faith. And he's not going to rewrite his word, so obviously they're not going to make it into the Bible at this point, but who knows where God will put them in society based on the way that you raised them. So parents, love your children. Keep working on being the best parent you can. Hey, I have not arrived in any way, shape, or form. My children are just small little toddlers at this point in time. But I want to do it right. So I'm going to implement these truths in my life. How about you? How about you? And as you implement these truths in your life, let me encourage you. Keep looking up and keep stirred up for the cause of Christ.